get started in about a minute.
Sorry, Tom.
Okay.
That's for the people who couldn't make it tonight.
Yeah. Let's see, we're at still a few people filtering in. All right, it looks like it's slowed down. What do you think, Eileen? Should we get going?
I'm good.
You want me to kick it off?
Yep.
All right, thanks everyone for joining. I know some of you were with us yesterday. Welcome back. And those of you who were not, glad you could join us. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about kind of where we are in the process of receiving and reviewing and considering proposals. And then we're actually going to discuss some proposals, both to sort of, get into the substance, which I know I'm anxious to do. Hope some of you feel the same way. There's been a lot about process, which is important, but really want to start actually talking about, our forest and the issues and trying to find some areas of agreement. I want to stop for a second and see if we've been joined by Chief Mann. Chief Mann, are you there?
He is not listed amongst
He's
the.
not. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, at some of the earlier work group meetings, there was a desire expressed to make some additional outreach to try to engage some Native American voices in this conversation, which we did. We were pleased that Chief Mann he's chief of the Turtle Clan of the Ramapo-Lenape Nation, agreed to join both work groups. And I'm sure he'll be joining us at some point, if not today. And when he does, we're going to, take the opportunity to have him share some of his thoughts with us. So hopefully we'll be able to do that at a future meeting. So I'm just going to review a little bit where we are in the process. So as everyone will recall, we created a sort of invitation for proposals with an initial deadline of I think we moved it to July 5th. We did receive 62 proposals as of July 5th, and I don't know whether we've received any since then, but we did also indicate that we're going to continue to accept proposals on a rolling basis. But we took those 62 as a batch for starters, as a first grouping, and the four co-chairs have been going through all those proposals and categorizing them and identifying proposals that met the basic criteria for proposal requirements that we're able to accept as they are and start to move forward into the conversation. There's another set of proposals where maybe they needed just a little bit of clarification. In some cases, if we had a proposal where we thought there were 3 or 4 different discrete ideas there, we might be going back to the sponsor saying, can you please break these down, because we really want each idea to be considered separately. And that's mostly because, let's say you've got 4 ideas in your proposal, maybe you can get people to agree to 3 of them, but if, sort of one of those ideas is not a consensus item, you don't want the other 3 ideas to basically, fall by the wayside because of disagreement over the one idea. So the more we can break these down into distinct ideas and proposals, the better. So that might be an example where we, come back to you and say, can you please just break this down into multiple proposals? In some cases, we got proposals that weren't really proposals. I mean, they might have been commentary statements, but there wasn't a specific recommendation that this task force could discuss and potentially adopt as a recommendation to the legislature. So In that case, we won't be bringing those proposals forward for discussion. But obviously we have read all of those as well. So this week, everyone will be getting an email back from the task force. I want to give a shout out to Allison Schmeider, who's our new intern supporting the task force. We're really pleased, grateful to have her help at this as we get into our kind of really busy stretch of the process here. So everyone will be hearing back on the status of your proposal. And as Eileen is noting, if you have questions today that you want to put into the chat, please send them to Allison, because just the way the chat feature is set up here, you have to select basically one of the co-hosts in order to communicate with the co-host. So direct any of your questions to Allison, and then she'll be helping to bring those questions to the fore. So yeah, expect to hear some people obviously already did hear back on the proposals that we brought forward yesterday, and that we'll consider today. Others will be hearing this week in terms of the status of your proposal. All of the proposals that have been accepted are being put into a shared folder, and this came up yesterday, so that everyone will be able to go in and see all the proposals that have been accepted, so you can browse them at your convenience and get a sense of what other proposals are out there, since we won't obviously be able to deal with all of these proposals at one time. What we're trying to do is to group these proposals into some kind of logical grouping around topic areas. So for example, today the proposals all relate to water resources, watersheds, water resource protection in some way. And so that's the logical grouping that we're bringing forward. We'll be doing the same with other proposals. As we go along, we'll try to have more advance notice. It's a little bit of a scramble between the July 5th deadline and these first July 11th, 12th work groups to honestly to have us read 62 proposals and wrap our heads around identifying a few that we could bring forward yesterday and today. We did intentionally try to pick some proposals that we thought were, not the most controversial issues that we know that we're all going to discuss, and that was intentional. We don't want anyone to think that, we're avoiding those hard issues. All of those issues are going to be discussed. But, this is a learning process for all of us, right? So we're all kind of getting to know each other and figure out, how to have this dialogue and how this process is going to work. So we wanted to bring some relatively less controversial proposals together first, just so we can all kind of get our feet wet and kind of figure out this process together, and then we'll refine that process as we go, and as we get into some of the more challenging issues. So that was our thinking. Not all this stuff neatly breaks down into an ecological health versus a climate issue. A lot of these issues are overlapping. The climate group yesterday was considering proposals related to funding. And, that funding could be for activities that were sort of more tied into climate objectives, or they could be for activities that were more tied into ecological health objectives. So it wasn't a perfectly neat, sort of placement of those within the two work groups. Some of that, to be honest, is going to be workload, right? We've got a lot of proposals. We've got two work groups. We need to make sure that if we had 2/3 of the proposals in one group and 1/3 of the proposals in another group, it's just not going to be very efficient. And so we need to spread the conversation around. In light of that, we're sort of, both work groups are open. If you're a member of one work group, right, but there's a proposal that's going to come up in one of the other work groups and you really want to be a part of that conversation, it's completely open, right? So I think as best we can, we'll try to place the proposals in the work groups that make sense, but it's not always going to be perfect. It's not always going to fall neatly in that way. So that's where we are in the process, and then what we're going to do. So for the proposals that we're going to consider today, we're really going to operate, focus on a consensus process, and that's really was the primary focus of this effort, really from the get-go. It's what Senator Smith asked us for, is to identify items of consensus and non-consensus. We're not going to be voting on any proposals at this point. We're still doing some work to nail down and clarify when and how and under what circumstances we're going to vote. We pledge to get that nailed down quickly because we know there's a lot of angst over that issue, and it's something we need to clarify quickly before obviously we get into any proposals where we might need to vote. But at this point, we're really, operating on consensus. We want to bring proposals forward. We want to try to get a sense of, and again, we started with some proposals that we thought maybe could be consensus items. We'll find out where, we shouldn't have to necessarily consider them as voting matters. So at this stage of the game, there's a couple different, pathways for a proposal that comes forward. One is, whether we can determine if that's a consensus item. It could be an issue where we think, maybe we're close to consensus, and with a little bit of work offline, we could get to consensus. So we could ask the proposal sponsor, and then maybe, others who are interested, or maybe others that have some issues that they want to try to get resolved, to work offline, and then, bring a proposal back and turn it into a consensus item. We could have items that are clearly non-consensus, and where we just have to basically call them that. And in any event, we'll be sort of, we've committed to document the various viewpoints. If an item is a consensus item, but there are, a very small number of people in disagreement, we would document who disagreed and the nature of their disagreement. And if it's a non-consensus item, we would document the different points of view and on the parties that held those points of view. So that's kind of where we are in the process. Let me just stop there, and Eileen or any of our Anjali is here. I don't know if Andy has joined us yet or not. Anything you guys want to add on kind of process where we are at this point?
Yeah, I think at this point yesterday, we invited clarifying questions, which you can either use the chats and you can send questions to Allison, or if you have a clarifying question at this point, you can use the raise hand feature, and then you'll be asked to unmute yourself and you can ask your question. So are there any clarifying questions on the process, or the consensus process, or the representation at this time? Otherwise, we can move into the proposals, but if there are questions, we'll take them. So I see Jean Montgomery has her hand up, and she'll be asked to unmute, and you can ask your question.
Okay, is there going to be like a bleed through of proposals that you might not have gotten to for a meeting to the next meeting? And how would that affect the two groups? In other words, if you're in group A and the questions and proposals from group B take longer than anticipated, are both groups still getting the same amount of proposal review time?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and an issue that we have already run into. We only got through one proposal yesterday. So today we have listed the proposals we didn't get to for today. Now, obviously that gives us a lot of proposals for today. We're unlikely to be able to meet those. So what we have learned is that, as Tom said, the topics are interrelated. They're really very interrelated. They're the climate and ecological health. We're finding difficulty parsing them out. So everyone will be invited to both meetings. We will try to make it topical, and this is for manageability. You see, today we have almost 90 people. We had almost the same number yesterday. You can't have a dialogue with 200 people. So what we're trying to do is keep them topical. We want to ensure that everyone who's interested in a topic gets to comment on it. But we're still figuring out the best way to do that, Jean. So, and yesterday and today are kind of learning experiences for us. Okay. I see.
Eileen?
Yep. Oh, I'm sorry. Tom.
That's all right. I just want to pause because I see we have Elaine Mann has joined us, and I don't know whether.
Oh, she's a participant.
Oh, that's not okay. I saw the MANN. It's the same spelling, and I thought maybe it was Chief Mann using a family member's Zoom or something like that. Okay.
Well, I know we
Not the
have.
same.
Not the same. All right, sorry, just checking.
All right, I see that Michael Van Cleef has his hand up, and he will be asked to unmute.
Yeah, I was just curious, are you going to provide a list of all of these submitted proposals? I mean, I personally, I assume you're going to do aggregation, but I'm just kind of curious to see, what's been submitted myself, like all the raw proposals.
Yeah, a lot of folks have. And what we are going to do, I don't know if Tom mentioned this, we're going to load them all the accepted proposals will be made available in a folder on the shared directory. Everything that like all four of us said, this one's ready to go. It's ready to be discussed. We also have some that are being rejected because they were they were commentaries. They really weren't proposals at all. Why waste your time reviewing something like that if we're not going to even present it? And then the bulk of them, frankly, were almost there. We felt they needed a little bit of revision for clarity or focus. So the sponsors for all of those revisions will be contacted within the next week or so to revise their proposals to make them more focused. And then they'll be moved into the accepted category, and they'll be loaded. So we heard pretty loud and clear yesterday that people want to see all of the accepted proposals regardless of when they're going to be discussed. And we see no issue with that. We just want to alert the proposal sponsors that that's going to happen before we post them. So for instance, Michael, you have one actually, right? You have a proposal. We would want to let you know we're loading up your proposal, in advance. So, hey, Michael, we're loading up your proposal. Here it is. And then the whole group has access. So that was a good suggestion that we heard yesterday that we are going to take. Okay, next, Tom or Anjali, Andy, have anything to add? All right, so next is Louis Gorman. You'll be asked to unmute.
Yeah, hi. Last time when we had the big session there, we talked a little bit about the state forest action plan and the state wildlife action plan. And is there a thought to asking the proposal developers to reference those plans in their proposal so we can see how it might link with existing plans that are already reviewed and approved by both the state and the feds?
Well, that's oh, Tom, did you want to?
I can think of a couple of proposals that did reference them. We got some proposals related to the need for more detailed forest planning that reference the state forest action plan as, sort of very broad and not, specific at the stand, or kind of landscape level. So, I mean, I can think of a few examples of people that did. So it's certainly encouraged. It's not required, but I think it's encouraged for people to have that as kind of a baseline understanding of what's out there.
I just wonder if that may be a way to, unless we're going to look at every proposal and rank every one of them, at some point it might seem we have to trim it down. So I'm just thinking that might be a tool to kind of, put the best up front if it's already tied into something that already exists.
Yeah, and both of those plans are in the shared directory for those people who want to take a look at it. All right, I have a question in the chat. Can we request an amendment on proposals that have already been discussed? This whole process is rather fluid and dynamic. And as we get new proposals, chances are some will relate back to proposals that we have already discussed. What they really are ideas, and the ideas will evolve as we discuss them. So it's not really an amendment. We're not that formal. It's ideas, and as we discuss more ideas, we'll evolve them towards the development of a report. So I guess that's a squirrely answer, but it's kind of a yes. Yes, as we learn more, as we review more and more proposals, we'll adapt and evolve. Louis, your hand is still up. Did you have a follow-up, or that's legacy? Okay. Oh, wait, he does. So Allie, can you unmute Louis? I think he had a follow-up. There he goes. Oh, no, there he goes.
Legacy hand.
Legacy hand.
I didn't know that term before this process.
Okay, we have another hand, Douglas Meckel.
Hi. I just have a quick process question. I made a proposal and, I just got it in on 7/5. And I would like to add a little bit of documentation. Does that sort of throw it back to the end to look again? Or how do I let folks know that I've done that so you don't, so you can sort of know that there's some added information?
Yeah, so you can go back in and edit, and it will show up on our end. We will see that you made an edit. And we are accepting them now on a rolling basis. The only hard and fast deadline for proposals is that August deadline. After August 31st, no more proposals. We needed an initial deadline to get things started. That's where we selected the proposals for yesterday and today. I think I know that there are some people working on proposals that they want to submit within the next week or two, and they'll be added to our list to review. So again, the process is fluid and it's dynamic, and you can go back and revise and it will show.
Okay, very good. Because my basic concept is the same, but I just had some additional documentation.
No problem.
I had to get some author's permission before I could quote their book.
Okay.
So,
Yep,
okay.
you can
Thanks.
add them in.
Thanks.
All right. Okay, I'm not seeing any more hands up. I guess we can go into the proposals themselves now, Tom, what do you think?
That'd be great. I think, yeah, maybe we can get through our three, and if we have time, we can pick up, some of the others that we didn't get to yesterday. And I guess one thing we wanted to try to do different from yesterday is we want to try to put a bit of a time constraint on how long we're going to spend on each proposal. And it's, I don't think we know for sure yet what the sweet spot is there. But it would be nice if we could consider a proposal and, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes or, something on that order. And, maybe some proposals that are more complex will take longer. But I just want to throw that out there so that people have that in mind that, again, there's how many people do we have on here? 89 people. So we really want to keep the conversation very tight. And anyway, I'll leave it at that and let's see how it goes.
All right, so with that, Greg Gorman is listed here. It was proposal number 19. Study the impacts of forest management techniques on New Jersey's aquifers and water supplies. So can we unmute Greg, please? And you have 2 to 3 minutes to present your proposal, and that will be followed by some clarifying questions and our process. So do we have Greg unmuted?
Are we sure Greg's on?
He is on. He is on. He might not be unmuted yet. Let's see. He's still on mute. Hey, Greg. There he is. There he is.
Okay. Let me prep this up here real quick. Yeah, our Sierra Club New Jersey chapter had formulated a forest conservation committee to develop and approve recommendations.
Greg, you're cutting off and you're frozen.
He might have frozen up.
The topic and the proposal.
Greg, if you can hear us, you were frozen. We didn't hear anything. Could you start from the top?
Greg, if you're having
I
Wi-Fi
said
issues, maybe
to
turn off
my
the video.
internet connection.
Yeah,
I'm
Greg, turn off your
I'm gonna
camera,
kill
turn
my
off-
video.
Yeah,
yeah,
turn off
turn
the
off
video.
video and that usually helps. That's an awesome picture.
Well, thank you. I'll start over again. I won't take the 3 minutes. Anyways, our Sierra Club New Jersey chapter formulated a conservation committee to develop and approve recommendations for the task force to consider. This proposal was written by an activist after discussion of the topic. The inception of the proposal was based on a conversation between Rich Isaac, our chapter chair, and Laura Howard, chair of the Passaic River Coalition. New Jersey's water resources provide vital services for life, economy, and enjoyment. Those forests and water resources so critical to the nation that federal government has mandated protection. Forest services provide a critical role in supporting the water cycle. Natural and stewardship-induced disturbances have a profound impact on groundwater and surface hydrology that is not yet fully understood. Our proposal recommends that any legislation allocate funds for the monitoring and analysis of forest management and its impacts on water supply and quality. This will discuss our decisions. And I'd like to supplement this a little bit. I received a number of questions and comments. The one this is
Greg, we lost you at
G.
questions and comments. When you said you got a number of questions and comments, then you were out.
He's from. Okay, I mean, I made some, got some questions and comments via email this morning. Mary, who I think is a retired New Jersey EP, has
Can I suggest that maybe, Greg, maybe you restart your computer or reboot your system, and then maybe we move on to a different proposal? Just because even the little bit that we heard from Greg, it was difficult to understand. I don't know if it was the same for everybody. That was my guess.
It was. If that's okay with Greg, I agree with that.
Yeah, I don't even see Greg, actually. Maybe he actually.
Yeah, he was on here, and he might be better off with a telephone connection, to tell you the truth, too. Sometimes that's helpful.
now I'm back on.
Oh, there he is. All right, Greg.
Now I'm back on. Yeah, you can thank the very unstable. Anyways, there was a comment made by Gene Montgomery. The DEP has programs that do water quality. One of those is the groundwater quality standards. But basically that addresses pollution charge. That's how that's have program.
All right, it really is difficult. We're not going to be able to like talk about the proposal. Greg, it's just way too garbled. I tell you what we're going to do. If you can consult with Angela, who's on the call, and I can call Greg
chemical and physical
and call back. We're going to move on to the next one. We really can't, Angela. We really
Yeah, I'm gonna text Greg. I'll let him know.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to the next one. But Greg, we heard some of it. We're hoping to get back to you afterwards. But we're going to move on. And I know I already checked that John Landau is next. And John, I don't know if you're doing this together with Dot Stillinger, but she was listed as your collaborator on your proposal. So if we can unmute John, and John, you can instruct us as to whether you're doing all the talking or if Dot's going to do some, however way you want to present your proposal. John Landau.
Can you hear me?
Yes, okay. I can see you.
So I regret that I'm going to do all the talking. Hadn't thought about involving Dot, and it's a little late now. So my proposal is pretty basic. It's that we need rigorous understanding and protection of the public forest's external watershed services, because this is a critical component for New Jersey to be able to adapt for climate change. There's 3 reasons why we must understand and protect the infrastructure services from the public forests. The first is the public forests catch about 25% of the rainfall in New Jersey because they cover about 25% of our land. That's pretty basic. The rainfall in the forest either evaporates locally, it infiltrates in the soil there, or it just runs off the surface. We need to keep in mind that New Jersey is the most densely populated state. In terms of watershed infrastructure services outside the forests, all of our public forests are basically urban forests because every county in New Jersey is an urban county. The forest rainwater that's not evaporated locally provides the drinking water for much of New Jersey, and the runoff contributes to the risk of surface and river flooding in the developed areas. There's really 2 parts to it. There's water quality, which is critical for the drinking water, and the water quantity is critical regarding flood risk. I'm going to talk mostly about water quantity because Greg and Christy, and I'm sure others, have got the water quality covered really, really well. I wish Greg could have finished first. The second reason is that NJFTF projects that the frequency of extreme rainfall events, 24-hour rainfall events, like those that we've had in the past, is going to be more frequent. And the future extreme rainfall events will be increasingly severe. Decade on decade, they're going to get worse. A 100-year storm, which we use pretty glibly, is the 1% year probability of 24 inches of rain, 24 hours, excuse me. Historically, that was about 7 to 8 inches across different New Jersey counties. The projections from NJFTF on the website in my proposal, it's a great website to go play with, are that this 1% probability per year storm will be 25 to 50% larger in different counties in New Jersey. I mean, there's a risk of a 12-inch rainfall in some of the counties in North Jersey, which is a really scary thought. And we might feel comfortable about this 1% probability per year because it sounds like low odds you might bet at in a poker game. But with a reasonable 50-year planning horizon, this 1% probability per year is equivalent to almost a 40% probability to happen in 50 years. So the 100-year storm should not be a surprise. It has to be an expectation. So that's the first 2 parts. The third reason our forests is that our forests are giant sponges. It's the only good term I've been able to find to explain what they do well. On their landscape scale, the forest leaf surfaces, the surface debris, and the root systems intercept and infiltrate a very large percentage of the rainfall down into the soil, and they typically leave only a small percentage of rainfall to be surface runoff to cause floods. The tree evapotranspiration makes trees into what Pam Zipsey from the Urban Forestry Organizations calls giant water pumps. The forests like ours typically return 50% of the rainfall locally. So that means that half the rainfall in our forests does not flow down in the watershed. Since our public forests catch about 25% of New Jersey rain, rule of thumb would mean that this evapotranspiration is going to locally return 12.5% of rainfall that otherwise would flow downstream. This is a lot of acre feet of water which is prevented from contributing to the floods. The water that's in the sponge that's not returned locally eventually flows through the water table and downstream of the ocean, but its flooding contribution is much lower than the surface runoff because the underground flow takes weeks and months. So that's the 3 facts that I think drive this need. And if we agree to pursue this, I would suggest there needs to be a forest watershed advisory council of some sort, formed with NJFTF hydrologists and forestry people and private organization watershed experts. This council should develop the practices needed to assess and manage the watershed services of our public forests. And I believe that many of these practices can be adapted from the ones that are being applied today for landscape development, because the calculations engineering needs to figure out how much runoff happens and all that is pretty well known. So that's the basis of the proposal. I'm sorry I had to read it off. I can't keep my brain going for 2 minutes straight, but now we discuss it.
Great, thank you, John. So if I can encapsulate, your proposal is for the formation of an advisory council to go over these issues on watersheds and forests as you described. So that's the proposal that's being put forth by John. And the process so far is you've heard it and you've been able to review any attached materials that John has included with this proposal. Is there anyone that has strong objections to the proposal as it is. And what we will do is that we'd ask you to raise your hand and voice what your objections might be. And here
Eileen,
we
did
go.
we
Was that how
also,
we were doing it?
well, I think we wanted to see first if anybody has clarifying questions.
Oh
or-
my gosh.
That's
You're right. I
okay.
moved right into,
Just leap right to it, right? Yeah.
I leaped right to it. You're right. Thanks,
But
Tom.
maybe just first, someone might want to ask a clarifying question of the proposal sponsor, and then we'll get to objections.
I was so eager. We do have hands up for clarifying questions, by the way. All right. So, and we go in the order that the hands went up. So I see Nancy Roberts Lawler. You'll be asked to unmute.
We're here. I just have a question. What is the defined practices shall be consistent wherever appropriate with the New Jersey DEP practices for development mean?
So John, you'll be asked to unmute too. Go
Referring
ahead.
to.
So Nancy, that's a great question. It's a vague statement because I'm not a hydrologist. But there are pretty rigorous practices that are applied by NJFTF for stormwater management in the developed part of New Jersey. This is what site plan reviews are for green teams and town engineers, et cetera, all the time. And the plant engineers have to go through these calculations. There's tools like iTrees.org has that the urban forestry people use to calculate the water sponginess from trees and shrubs. So there's a lot of tools out there that are mostly for the developed world. The logic behind them, I think, means they can be adapted to deal with forests, but they probably won't apply directly as is, because I'm not sure how they would apply directly as is. Maybe they can. Make sense?
Yes.
Thank you, Nancy. Next with the clarifying, was that satisfactory, Nancy? That was okay. Okay, next is Elliot Ruga. You'll be asked to unmute. And John, and keep John unmuted. These questions are going to John.
John, I think your proposal is very sound. And of course, the important functions of our forests in mitigating flooding and other watershed values are extremely important. But what happens if such a council, or how does it comport with other very important aspects of forest resources, such as climate sequestration? What would benefit a watershed aspect may impact the ability of a forest to be efficient as for carbon sequestration? How would you comport the two interests?
That's a tough one that may be above my pay grade. Maybe something the legislature has to deal with in the end, but I think we'll find that the premises that are related to climate sequestration are the same ones that apply to maximum sponginess. Leaf area, the soil sponginess, the root area, mycelia, all that type of stuff. The leaf duff, that's what makes the soil, the water get absorbed so effectively in the forest compared to on lawns and impervious surfaces. I think that's something the advisory team council will have to figure out. I think that my guess is there will be several sort of specialist councils. I'm hoping there'll be one for invasive species, for example, once again, like other states have. And somehow the state's going to figure out how to consolidate the output from these different councils and figure out how to mesh them together. I don't know how to answer that right now.
Okay, is that good, Elliot? Okay. Next we have Emil DeVito. You are
Hi,
unmuted.
everybody. Hi. I just wanted to point out that probably from about 1980, I'm not sure, but sometime in the early 80s until about the mid 90s, there was a Forest Advisory Council composed of members of the public who are experts in various fields regarding proposals for forestry on public land in the Pine Barrens. And I sat in on those meetings, between 25 and 30 years ago. They were open to the public. They were more than just the stakeholder process, because the Forest Advisory Council, you know, had a little bit, it was not just people asking questions and making statements and wishing for things. The Forest Advisory Council actually got to engage the DEP when they had a proposal for doing a public forestry application in the Pinelands. It worked really well. And, you know, plenty of forestry was done, and that yet there were representatives from all sorts of fields regarding plants and animals and ecosystem processes and that sort of thing. And I don't really remember why it was abandoned. I think it was when the leadership of the Pinelands Commission changed, and the Pinelands Commissioners changed, and they just sort of got rid of it, because I think some people complained that all the experts, you know, were being a pain in the butt. But it really worked well when it existed, and should be considered.
Okay, yeah, and also to clarify, John, your council in your proposal is specifically for watershed issues, your advisory council, or was it more?
Yeah, so
general?
no, mine is meant to be watershed services, because I think that's an area of expertise. I mean, I think we need to have a technocracy. It's kind of like what Emil described from this other group, which sounds more like it was ecological health.
Yeah.
But this technocracy needs to understand the ways to measure and manage relative to the watershed services that fall outside the forests, and then those need to be matched up against the other issues of managing the forest. So that's my thought here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John. And our next question we have from Louis Gorman.
Yeah, hi, John. Do you see the role of this group as being primarily advisory, or does it have more teeth than that? Or is that something you're thinking about changing as the process moves on? Or I guess what I'm concerned with is that we just heard that, you know, these things can come and go depending on who's in the administration. You know, they don't like commissions, like under Christie, they're all gone. Any thoughts on that, on how you would?
I think that's a great input. We probably need to think on if we think advisory councils should exist, we should figure out how to make sure they have a sunshine law so they're useful, but if they're still useful, they must be protected. I think that this group, in my view, this group sets the practices and the policy. NJFTF still has to create the regulations. As kind of a loose example, I believe there's invasive species advisory councils in some other states, and those councils, the people, are the groups that are authorized to define what goes on to those invasive species management lists. It's not bureaucrats deep in the state. It's this council of technical experts, include people from the state and from elsewhere. That's kind of what I hope we'd see here. But yeah, that's a great point, Louis. I'm not sure how to make stuff protect stuff against people who want to kill it, but I think we should try.
Thanks, Louis. Thanks, John. Our next questions. Oh, where's my hand raisers? The next one is Jean Montgomery. And you are unmuted.
I think John's proposal needs to have a bit of more clarification about what this council's purpose would be in recommending things. Councils are usually advisory, and people can take their advice in government, or they cannot take their advice. I would suggest that maybe everyone here all agrees that the existing forest land in the state properties are serving this hugely valuable stormwater sponge function. But what you're talking about is about how we can regulate future, bigger, faster storms in the existing community. And I would recommend that is outside the purview of this group, and really the function of Stormwater Management Advisory Council or some sort of activism amongst the promulgation of those regulations on our existing community. I think we all agree that the values of the forest in serving as a reservoir for stormwater is huge.
Those are good thoughts. I mean, the reason I put forth the proposal is because my understanding is that the responsibilities we assign to the landscape developers to manage their stormwater is not in any way reflected in how we manage our forests. They seem to be sort of separate worlds. So I don't know how to create that responsibility in our public lands, both the county forests and the state forests, unless somebody steps up and says that we're going to do that. And it may not be appropriate to have it be the same one that manages the development side, because landscape development is a very commercial, financially driven business with huge numbers of politics and lawyers, and we don't want that world to add extra complexity to the forest, I don't think. So
Okay.
I guess I would still propose that we should consider this.
Okay. Jean, did that address? Oh, she's, okay.
Yeah, I think just in the interest of time, Eileen, I would keep it moving.
Yeah, okay. The next, yeah, yeah, again, clarifying questions and for John. And next I have Ken Dolsky.
Yes, I like John. I like this proposal. The one aspect I think of a lot of these proposals that call for this kind of analysis and prioritization is that, and I'll use the analogy. We have the Highlands Act, which is supposed to protect water resources. Yet, plenty of things happen in the Highlands Council that one could question are not necessarily, in the best, doing the best job of protecting water supplies. I am a firm believer that in any kind of group like this or an analysis, that if the controlling organization, in this case, I guess the DEP, were to reject the proposal from this group, that they should be required to lay out their scientific evidence that gives them, power to overrule it, or gives them a better, a good valid reason for overruling it. I think very, very often what happens with government bodies is they can just say no, and you have no recourse, and you can't even argue that you understand what their reasoning is. So to the extent that you could give it more power by creating a call for that kind of scientific analysis, I think it's helpful in any kind of proposal like this. I'd also just like to make one other general recommendation in looking at this and looking at Joe's Basrelian's proposal that we talked about last night. I think everything that is involved with water ought to be grouped together rather than necessarily putting all the funding proposals together, or put it in both categories so that you have a comprehensive set of proposals around water that include funding it, and then how that funding is going to be used. So for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, good points. Those were good points. John, did you want to respond or?
Yeah, in terms of aggregation, I absolutely would like to see this proposal evolve to merge with what we saw so far of Greg's and Christie's, because these things are very closely related. The whole funding discussion, I think, is sort of a separate piece of logic to consider, but certainly the objectives and processes we want to follow should be brought together where we get more efficiency from being logical that way. In terms of giving it more power, that's tough. There is a ton of science behind this. Obviously, it's not going to fit in a 2,500 in a short format like this for proposals. The properly formed advisory council should have the power to set up practices. It all starts with measurement. Today, we do not have any measurement to say that this forest land, this specific forest, has this specific watershed services effect in its watersheds. We need to measure each forest as best we can. We need to monitor that going forward. We need to understand what the watershed risks are outside of that forest, because that's what we're trying to protect. And once there's measurements that are regularly made, then the management practices have to protect those and even enhance them if possible. But until there's measurements, we got nothing. And right now we have nothing.
Yeah, well, it's just that organizations like the DEP don't have a habit of forcing themselves to scientifically justify positions that may go against their an advisory board.
Well, in stormwater management, they have their feet are held to the fire, and they've got some good people doing good work in the developed landscape. So this one's kind of they're less starved because stormwater management's a big piece of the state's requirements.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Louis, I just want to point out, you still have your hand raised. Is that because you have another question or legacy? Legacy, okay. All right. So next we have Nancy Roberts-Waller.
Hi, I just wanted to point out that there already exists the New Jersey Water Quality Monitoring Council, which is a multi-agency. It's huge. It's about 40 people. I happen to be a member. It's a multi-agency, multi-nonprofit group, includes some outside professionals that advise New Jersey DEP, USGS, and EPA in New Jersey water quality policy and practices, specifically as it relates to assessment. And, there may be some ability to coordinate or add on to, the responsibilities of that group. Also in New Jersey, the Watershed Institutes coordinates the Watershed Watch Network, which is an advisory group that discusses a multitude of issues relating to water quality. And before we say that there is no data, I think we should contact, both of those groups.
I would love to get contacts there if you could help me, Nancy. It's a great point.
Absolutely. I will send you an email.
Thank you. And actually back to Jean, I apologize for forgetting to mention this. Jean, you and I should probably go one-to-one and have more discussion if you'd like to by email.
We can connect you. So what I'm hearing, John, Jean, and Nancy so far to connect a little bit, maybe discuss a little. Okay, so next is Jim Lyons.
Thanks. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, good. I'm going to just offer this observation from my own experience working with Forest Service and other big agencies. While I have no doubt that it's important that we monitor the management of watersheds, but somebody already commented on the fact that there's probably overlap between the things we seek to do to address climate change and the things we want to do to ensure that we're good stewards of our watersheds. So one approach to consider, as opposed to the risk of creating advisory groups for every particular concern that we have, is that we recommend that a science advisory committee be put together to provide input and oversight to the New Jersey Forest Service, and that it have expertise that can deal with watersheds and wildlife and perhaps climate mitigation, though that tends to be a larger issue. You might even consider outdoor recreation and forest health generally. Otherwise, I worry we're going to have to create an advisory committee for each of the issues that we're concerned about. I think science is an important element, and the science committee ought to be staffed or ought to be composed of people with expertise in these various areas that are well respected and balanced in their perspectives, if you will. And then I would just separately maybe jump ahead and suggest that similarly, there should be a public advisory committee that can offer perspectives that may be outside the realm of science, but certainly are important from the standpoint of managing our public forests. And that may be a way to capture the science element, as well as I think some of the other elements I hear that are at the foundation of some of the comments that are being made by my colleagues.
Okay, that seems general beyond John, but
Jim, that sounds excellent. I'd sort of recommend maybe that's another proposal to do. I believe there are other proposals coming forward asking for other advisory councils sort of like this. And so I think that thinking through the bigger strategy of how to accomplish this is important.
all right. Okay, so we'll call on Margaret Wood to unmute.
Okay, hello? Okay, I want to answer and
We can hear you, Margaret.
okay, I want to answer an earlier question they asked if spongy forest floors will lead to greater carbon sequestration or not, and it will, because I was doing my research last night, and in order to have a spongy forest floor that's a healthy forest floor, you need a good balance of three things: bacteria for compost, mycorrhiza, and vegetation. The mycorrhiza and vegetation have a symbiotic relationship, which allows both to get stronger. The mycorrhiza takes sugar from the tree roots and supplies water to the tree roots. So the amount of water supplied to the tree increases maybe like, I don't know, 20-fold if you have mycorrhiza present. I'm just making that up, but it's a huge amount. Trees who have proper water all year round will be stronger, able to grow. If the mycorrhiza are missing, which happens when you have invasive jumping worms, I was reading about that. If the mycorrhiza are missing, the tree roots do not get the water that they need during times of drought. They become more susceptible to withering, which means you have one of these big storms and it can fall over, or it could just die from lack of nutrients. So a spongy forest floor is a sign of a good balance of mycorrhiza, bacteria, and vegetation, and it's desirable for a healthy forest, healthy trees, which will mean more carbon sequestration. Thank you.
Okay, Margaret, thank you for that. I don't think there was a question in there. So John, we'll move on to the next question. I'll remind folks that at this point, we really are looking for clarifying questions on this specific proposal. We're at about 17 minutes, Tom, for this topic.
Yeah, I'm starting to feel like we should try to wrap up the discussion of this one and, take the temperature of the room in terms of where people are conceptually on this idea. And I say conceptually because I think the way this is going to work throughout this process is we're going to go from like broad to more specific as we go, right? So we're at the stage of the game where we don't have to have every detail of this proposal nailed down now. We want to get a sense of like direction, right? So like I might phrase it the way I read this, John, is there's a couple of key concepts. There's this notion that one, protection of water resources and a watershed, assessment and management approach should be a fundamental, not sort of the only, but a fundamental driver of how we approach the management of our public forest lands. That for that to be successful, there's got to be assessment, right? We've got to have more data, more understanding of those water resources kind of in a watershed, context. There's got to be input in some capacity, right? From experts, including outside experts, whether that's an advisory committee just for this issue, or it's part of a larger advisory committee. I think we could kind of figure that out as the conversation evolves. And then, that science and that expertise has got to be reflected in the way, our public forest lands are managed right? So it's sort of like there's a sense of this should be a priority. There's got to be assessment and data. There's got to be expertise, and then that's got to be reflected in the, sort of the management plans and management practices on the ground. To me, that's like the thrust of what you're saying. And, there's a lot of details there that you could figure out in terms of how to operationalize that. But tell me, does that capture the overarching direction of what you're
Yeah,
suggesting?
Tom, you could have done my overview for me. Thank you. And I don't have any expectation that we're going to resolve how to pursue this at this point in time. It's going to take a bunch of discussion and thought and evolution to solve that aspect. So my proposals for how to move forward were just first draft rough proposals.
Right. So I would love, and I know there's people that have hands up, and but I would love to sort of get a sense on the way I just phrased it, and the sponsor has, said that I've accurately kind of captured the thrust of his proposal. Like, I would love to know, does anybody object with that conceptually?
Well,
right?
let me lower all the hands first. Are you looking for hands up for that question, Tom? So
Yeah, and then maybe, once we cross that threshold, we'll come back to the folks that had their hands up, and
okay.
in the spirit of, trying to keep us moving along.
Sure.
Does anybody have an issue with sort of that concept, something that this task force might put forward with more details to be, fleshed out?
Okay.
Okay, we got one hand up.
Yeah.
So let's ask Jean to unmute and give her a chance to explain her thinking.
I think that part of the proposal needs to be the how. And I go back to the Senator Smith request to figure out how this can be done via legislation, I believe. And so I think we need to focus back on how would we do that? How would we create an advisory council for that watershed concern?
Actually, the legislature can call for an advisory council. They have in the past, if that's something that they feel is a necessary thing to move forward, they can put out a bill calling for the formation of a council.
Okay.
Right. And they could provide, additional direction to DEP in terms of the importance and prioritization of, assessing and protecting and managing the water resources on our public lands, and create whatever advisory body, might be necessary to, assist the department in that endeavor. That can all be done through legislation, which is exactly what we're saying here, that could be a recommendation of this task force, right? That would sort of elevate the focus on the assessment of and the management of water resources and watersheds on our public lands. John, you have an objection, or just a? Oh, we got to ask John to unmute.
Yeah, let's ask John.
All right, John, we're not hearing you yet. Hold on.
John Thonay to unmute.
John Thonay.
There he goes.
There we go.
Yes, I totally support what you said, Tom, and what Jim was talking about. I just wanted to point out that as a member of the New Jersey Highlands Coalition, I follow pretty closely the Highlands Act. And the Highlands Act is a perfect example of a master plan for an entire region, including a master plan for its forests, which really dove deep into the science of watershed management. And of course, the Highlands provides water for a great deal of our state. So there's one example of where it has actually already been done. You can probably look at the Pinelands as well, and that they have similar studies with regard to the importance of the Pinelands for water supply. So those two areas have a lot of the information we're looking for. But it doesn't change the fact that it would be a good idea, as Jim Lyons had said, if the DEP forest regulations were overseen by a public group of advisors, as well as an expert group of advisors, just to make sure that all public forests are studied in a manner similar to the way the Pinelands and the Highlands have been studied.
Okay, thank you. There are hand raises. We saw consensus on this proposal, so I thought we were ready to move on, but then hands went up. If you're objecting, we're looking at people who are objecting to the proposal. So if you're objecting, keep your hand up. If it's a commentary, I think we all kind of agreed that we're okay with this one. So I'm seeing that Douglas Meckel's hand is still up, so I'm assuming you have an objection.
Sort of. I like the proposal, but I think there's related issues that can't be separated, protecting sort of older stands. Some of the things for carbon capture and species protection can't be separated out of watershed. And I think that an advisory council would be well served by addressing sort of those conservation issues. So maybe we not only have a carbon store and a species store, but a water store so instead of having 3 different councils, that sort of the focus be merged around those issues that are nominally, they're not going to be in tension.
What I would suggest, I hear that concern, and Jim raised the same thing. What I would suggest, if John is amenable to this, is that we say we remain fluid on that as the conversations go forward. I think, unless John, you're wedded to a council only focused on water, that we say the proposal on the table at the moment is focused on water. But if as we go forward, we get other proposals that suggest there be a broader advisory council that deals with multiple issues, that we'll discuss it then, right? And so this could morph into something broader, unless John feels like it's this and only this.
I'm totally fluid on the how, because that's very speculative right now and very thin. And I'm also open to working on the what with other people concerned about watershed to get this to be more solid and complete.
Yeah, I think it can. I guess what I'm saying is I think it can evolve as we go, Doug. We're not viewing this proposal as totally rigid, in that if we get into other proposals that talk about broader advisory scientific advisory councils, we'll connect the dots at that point. We'll say, well, how does this relate to the John's proposal where we said there'd be does it make sense to merge them? We'll call that question then. But that's not really on the table right now because we don't have a proposal exactly of that nature. I'm guessing we probably are going to get one. I hope we will. And we'll talk about it, and then we can reconcile these things at that point. But let's not snatch, defeat from the jaws of victory. So, I think if we've got a consensus item here, let's call it that for now. Things are going to evolve. And I would love to move us on to another proposal. If there's
Greg Gorman, Greg is on the phone. Greg Gorman.
So if I could just quickly say that if anybody would like to engage me one-on-one after this, please drop me an email and I'd be happy to have discussion and learn from you. So if we can't cover it right now, please get me later.
Yeah.
John, if you could send us your email, we'll send it to everyone. Just put it in the chat real quick.
So Joe and Larry, do you have comments or questions on this proposal, which has already been deemed a consensus item that need to be heard, or can we move on?
Their hands are still up, Tom.
Okay. Go ahead. Somebody unmute Joe. Thank you.
Not really objecting to this, just endorsing what you're saying. I think we can get more ambitious along the lines of Tom, you and the last couple of speakers. I would love to see this grow into something more ambitious. That's all.
Okay, great. There's plenty of time and opportunity for that.
And then Larry and Ilse Baum.
Yeah, hello.
We hear you.
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering, wouldn't it be simpler just to put like a forever wild type mandate on our watershed lands, like the Catskills and Adirondacks, New York?
That sounds like a proposal.
Yeah, well, it is.
I think we've got some proposals along those lines we'll be talking about. So
okay,
yeah,
all right, yeah, okay.
This will all build upon itself, but we're just going to have to get there in steps, and the picture. These things will eventually sort of begin to meld together as we go.
Okay, that's fine then.
Thank you.
All right, are we ready for Greg? All right, we just asked Greg to unmute. He's still showing as muted. Hmm. For the phone, is it *6?
Okay.
Oh, there he is.
I'm on. Okay, you got it?
We hear
Okay,
you,
I won't
Greg. Yeah.
read every. Okay, I'm just going to end out. Our proposal recommends that any legislation allocate funds for the monitoring and analysis of forest management and its impacts on water supply and quality. This will provide a basis for assessing the impacts of forest management and provide a basis for future decisions. Dean Montgomery made a comment via email this morning. I just want to say we're aware that the DEP has a variety of standards and monitoring systems for groundwater as well as surface water, rivers, etc. I think the intent of this was basically to analyze the impacts of the forest stewardship in any activity or processes that are implemented and monitoring those. Anyways, I'm open for questions if that's sufficient.
Okay, and hopefully folks have had an opportunity to read the proposal and the accompanying material. So clarifying questions at this time.
I think somebody suggested that we combine my proposal with the other two water quality proposals, and I'm in agreement with that.
Okay, Greg, thanks. All right, I'm showing Elliot Ruga has a question for you, Greg.
Okay.
Hey, Greg, how are you?
Very good.
I'm wondering if it would be appropriate, as you know, that forest management is exempt from the water quality regulations in the Highlands Preservation Area and in conforming municipalities in the Highlands. I'm wondering if whatever study that is done as a result of this could look at the impact of these regulations being exempt and non-exempt and show what the different impact would be on our water resources.
Yeah, that would be good. This would establish a baseline to benchmark or compare. For instance, in Sparta Mountain, I think it's the Morris County Parks had done some, seed tree selection. Seed tree removal, about 20 or 30 acres up there. They're not subject to the management rules, et cetera. We could probably compare data from there with some other site that may be subject to forest management regulations.
Something to consider since we're trying to get establish a baseline.
Yeah, this would be good.
All right, thanks, Greg. Good proposal.
Okay, next we have
Thank you.
Ken. Sorry, Greg. Ken Dulski. He'll be asked to unmute.
Yeah, thanks. So I generally agree with this proposal. However, I think that any proposal that includes the acceptance of existing management techniques like harvesting and thinning and logging is not acceptable. I think that basically approving or supporting this proposal basically agrees with those techniques, and the whole purpose of this task force is really around those techniques. So I would not support this proposal as written for that reason.
Okay, so that was, that's a statement. I don't know, Greg, if you wanted to respond, or we can move on to the question.
Well, send some language to me via email, and then we'll take a look at it.
You could just say management techniques cover a wide range of methods, and therefore, you need to consider them all or something like that.
So a little word tweaking.
But if you want, I'll send you language.
Yeah, send me some language so don't get confused, particularly since we're thinking of merging with the other two proposals.
Okay, well, I will send you something. All right, thank you.
All right, I thought I saw another hand. Did one go down? All right, I see Kristen Maestro.
Yeah, hi. So I have two questions. The first is that, with any kind of monitoring, are you looking at, I think it's important to consider the scale at which you're monitoring and whether or not you're going to be looking at site specific or larger watershed, and considering the cost of that. And then also wondering what you are, the intent is for this the watershed monitoring. And then also, if you have suggestions on where funds could come from to be able to cover this. And I also, just one clarifying point, that forestry work is not exempt from wetland regulation rules. They are exempt from getting a permit.
Okay, I'll go backwards on that. No, I didn't identify any funding source for the activity. And as for the monitoring, I think the decision can be made whether, you do 100% or do sampling, but I think a program or monitoring program, smart people, would recognize, hey, if we're going to do some kind of forest management, control burn here, there, the other thing, and obviously risk analysis is done, and maybe we need to monitor the groundwater or the surface water or both. I think that's a discretionary thing.
Thanks, Greg. And that brings me to the point of like the whole evolution. When we have suggestions, we're necessarily going to think of funding, right? So let's, we'll keep all of these ideas in mind as we move forward, because whatever recommendations we make, funding will always be the next question, right?
Yeah, and we already started the conversation yesterday about possible funding sources, and the question then was, what's the funding going towards? So I think it's okay that eventually, again, these streams will come together, right, as we begin to identify activities that we want to see happen, and then separately we're having conversations about possible ways to fund them. So I think it's okay to sort of put that, where does the money come from, aside for the moment, since we're having those funding conversations as well.
Yeah, I'm not.
Yeah, that's a good. I was going to say that's a good point. I'm not a professional forester, but in my prior work, I dealt with budgeting and planning, and typically you identify the needs, and then once you've identified the needs and the costs associated with those, then you go digging for the funding. Good example is the Green Acres program. A lot of those projects are funded by state municipalities as well as counties, three funding sources. Some of the DEP's water monitoring programs are funded, but in compliance with the federal EPA guidelines, and they provide funds for that, or a portion of funds for it.
Right.
So yeah, there's lots of opportunities, to identify funding sources.
So Greg, again, as I think about the sort of the real heart of what you're proposing here, it's that, again, a recommendation the task force could make would be the legislature would direct the DEP to do some study and some assessment of the impacts of various forest management practices on water resources, right? And then, I don't know,
right.
So that's it in a nutshell. So maybe if you agree with that,
that's it.
Okay. So if you agree with that statement of your proposal, can we at this point, call the question as I just stated it? Does anyone object to that, the way I just stated it? the legislature to direct the DEP to do an assessment of the impacts of various forest management practices on water resources. Like we have Don.
Yeah,
Donnelly.
Don Donnelly.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd say I directly am opposed to it, but I just like to point out that there are studies by a lot of academics throughout the entire country on this very issue. And I don't know that we have to reinvent the wheel here in New Jersey without first looking to some of the resources from these different scientific organizations on this very issue to answer some of these questions. So, you know, in that context, I'd say maybe compile a literature review before we assemble a whole nother advisory council and another thing legislatively that can be accomplished by some academics putting together a literature review of what's already available. And I think to a point earlier that maybe John Thonet made, places like the Highlands Council, Highlands Commission already probably have a lot of this baseline data that we can use as a foundation for. So
Yes.
Yeah,
that's
and
all I have.
Don, sometimes directing a study is a literature review. I think DEP was directed to do something similar on climate change, and it wound up being a very large literature review rather than its own little study. So maybe we can reword some of this to incorporate, including the vast, the resources that are currently available. So that's a really good point. Okay, Vin Lang.
Hi, I think it's a generally good proposal. I do take I'm taken a little bit aback by that it seems sort of one-sided to scrutinize forest management alone. There's a lot of literature on how forest management is beneficial for watersheds and water recharge, and diversification of watersheds for young trees, maximizing stocking to kind of uptake water or create gaps to kind of offset the flashiness of overland flow, et cetera. So I would be okay with this proposal if it also considered the effects of preservation or like not active management within a watershed on water quality as well. So just my kind of 2 cents.
So maybe we can include that. To me, when I hear forest, I include passive management as a forest technique, but perhaps it needs to be identified specifically. I don't see Greg, but Greg, are you amenable to something like that, adding that language?
Yeah, and I'm just thinking in terms of Dawn's suggestion, maybe I should amend this to basically read, the setup of the funding for maybe establishment of this study initially, and then follow it up as necessary, to do the monitoring.
Sure.
At a later date, time phase it, give me some money now to say Rutgers or one of the other universities to do that literature research, come up with a report, and then compare that with some of the management. And like I say, it's the monitoring, can be used to verify some of the findings or determine whether some of those soil conditions might be a variable, and they can just do a lot of things, but the important thing was to, hey, we're going to do some things to the forest, we're going to disturb it, and we have an intent that's going to improve water runoff or prevent flooding or whatever that objective is. It'd be nice, if we can make sure that it doesn't impair the quality of the water, either in the surface or the groundwater, and this is what the intent of this was, make sure that the techniques that we're using get the desired effects.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Nancy? It's Nancy Roberts Lawler.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I agree with Vin and Don in general that, we have to be mindful that a lot of forest management techniques are designed to improve water quality, and that it's important that we look at data that already exists, and perhaps there should be some effort to put it into plain language and not as, not scientific, sometimes as some of these studies are written in a language that is a little dense for people outside of the water quality world. So I think that I agreed with those two suggestions.
Okay, thank you. Kristen Maestro?
Yeah, so I won't repeat exactly what Don, Vin, and Nancy just said, but I do agree with them. And I had written this in the chat about a clarifying question for process, and perhaps that this could help with some of this, is that right there's going to be a lot of potential agreement with conditions. And I know, Tom, you are getting at that, but I think it might be useful to maybe separate these into categories of, who agrees with the proposals as is, who agrees with the proposals, the general idea with the proposal, but has conditions that they would like to include. Because I think as is,
Yeah. That's actually what we're trying to do. So
yeah,
objections, but what we're hearing are tweaks, and I think the tweaks people are in agreement with them, I think.
Right. And we can make that on the spot if
Yeah.
the proposal sponsor agrees, and then the proposal sponsor can say, no, I'm not willing to amend my proposal that way. I want it, I want to know where people are on it as is, but they can also agree if they sense it's going to help them get consensus. I mean, I think what I heard is the tweaks would be that we wanted an analysis of forest management practices on water resources, and that would include both like active and passive management, right? And the impacts could be positive, they could be negative, right? It's sort of that holistic look at how does the various suite of forest management approaches, from the more active to more passive management approaches, impact water resources in positive or negative ways. And we want to draw upon, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, and we want to draw upon existing research and studies, as opposed to this doesn't need to be reliant solely on original, field research in New Jersey to answer those questions. So those are the things that I heard. So the question is, would the proposal sponsor accept those tweaks, modifications to your proposal? And if so, if stated in that way, then does anyone object at that point?
Perfect. I appreciate that clarity.
So Greg, are you willing to entertain?
Oh
those
yeah,
tweaks?
no, definitely, yeah. I would agree with that. That's just good business practice, before you spend money on something, to do it. Check out the literature, and check with the experts and see what they think about it and develop that. And that's the one way you would do that. So in some places it may not be necessary to monitor water quality, but other places, for a variety of reasons, it could be a large source and we're trying something different, and there might be some soil condition or underlying geology that may be disrupted somehow. That may potentially have an impact on water quality, and you could expand this, to also say carbon sequestration or any other ecological objective that you want.
Right. All right. So Greg is on board with that. Margaret and Jim, are you objecting or just commenting, or?
I object to the changes. I don't agree with including old science, which has since been disproven, because we know so much more today than we did back then. The role of mycorrhiza in making healthy trees is a relatively new science compared to what you knew decades ago. And practices which were created decades ago don't include the new science. So I object to relying too much weight on old science.
Well, Margaret, we didn't say old science, we just said existing science. So wouldn't you want the new science considered too?
New science, yes, but I don't want you to take science from 30 years ago and give it too much credit when it has since been disproven.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Okay, Jim?
That's Jim Lyons. We'll ask him to unmute.
Sorry, Jim, we still can't hear you. Are you able to unmute?
There we go. I'm sorry, I apologize. If you all take your phones and just look up watershed science, you'll find that that goes on for pages and pages and pages and pages and pages. I mean, this is a long-standing area of research. And so my only request would be that we narrow the scope and make sure it applies solely to the watershed issues we're concerned about in New Jersey forests. And that probably the only distinction is the hardwood forests in the north and the pinelands to the south in terms of the differences in terms of conditions. My concern is that we not try to overwhelm, or we don't end up overwhelming the state Forest Service or others who might be involved in this research, because it can go on and on. I understand the concern about the health of our watersheds, and I think some basic work could be done there to try to make sure that our management practices are sound and are achieving those outcomes. I disagree with the old science comment, just because I'm 69 and I know a lot of old science. But I would also suggest that sometimes research validates and reinforces some of that. So we need to narrow the scope of these things so we're not overwhelming the agency and investing a lot of time and energy in rehashing kind of established science, and focus on some key questions that we think are going to make a difference in terms of the management of our watersheds. My only point.
Okay, thanks. We have Larry.
I think our discussion.
I'm sorry, Greg, you like to respond?
One of the reference, if you dig into it, the British Columbia study, basically their conclusion was that there's a lot more work to be done in terms of this area, you know. And so whether it's old science or new science, there's still a lot of things to learn.
Yep. All right, let's take one last comment from Larry, and then I really want to make sure we get to our third water proposal today, and we still have time to do that if we can wrap this one up.
Yeah, I somewhat agree with Margaret, and one does have to be wary that there has been a lot of timber industry money that has flowed into certain universities and has influenced some of the studies. And there's like a lot of greenwashing of various terms and stuff that goes on, so you do have to be careful. Anyway, just a quick comment.
Yeah. So yeah. I would say, unless any of my co-chairs view this otherwise, to me, this sounds like a consensus item. There's a couple of cautionary flags being raised here, which we can note. You know, this was a consensus item. Several individuals expressed concern about not relying on you know, older science or science funded by industry organizations, et cetera. I mean, we can flag that as several people identified this concern. But I think otherwise, this sounds to me like a consensus item, and I think we should move on.
I agree, Tom. All right, so I checked, and I do believe that Christy McDonald is on the call, and she will be presenting her proposal. So Christy McDonald, I think she's unmuted.
Hi, everyone. I am the co-author of this proposal with Mara Tippett, both at Raritan Headwaters. I'm not sure if she's on here, but I'm the one who's mainly presenting. The title of the proposal is that we would like to see the strongest watershed protections on public forest lands. Requirements should be put in place to protect critical watershed features such as streams, springs, wetlands, vernal pools, aquifers, and steep slopes on public forest lands, subject to forestry, agriculture, and urban development. That's not an exhaustive list of things that could happen. We want to suggest a few of these stronger oversights and protections. One of them is mapping of all critical watershed features and should include not only permanent, but also ephemeral habitats, such as small headwater streams and vernal pools. We're also suggesting establishing science-based meaningful minimum buffer sizes that are protective of a variety of ecosystem functions in streams and wetlands. We're suggesting maximum protections, like similar to what's on a Category 1 stream of 300-foot buffers. There's a lot of scientific literature that justifies that. And wetland buffers, 300-foot buffer. But then for vernal pools, 1,000-foot buffers to maintain the connections between the vernal pools and uplands surrounding the pools for biodiversity. And we also made a suggestion of protecting soils on steep slopes. There should be no alteration of slopes with a gradient of 10% or greater. These are just suggestions that should be subject to discussion and more research on what the best protections would be. And I think that this is just something to add. Forested land at the watershed scale is associated with higher water quality in streams and aquifers and is the main source of clean drinking water for the majority of the population. Forested riparian ecosystems and wetlands and their buffers provide critical functions of maintaining water quality by filtering nutrients and other contaminants, shading and cooling water temperatures, providing habitat for aquatic and terrestrial organisms, maintaining channel morphology by stabilizing banks and slowing and storing stormwater. Many of these relate back to climate change and the increases in precipitation and major storms that we're getting. And these ecosystem services, and it's not an exhaustive list of these services, would cost billions of dollars annually for us to replace. So I really agree that it would be good to be working with the rest of the watershed group and some of the people who commented, including comments I received from Jean Montgomery today about this proposal to make it stronger, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion about it. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to open it up to clarifying questions for Christy on her proposal. So let's see, I have Kristen Maestro.
Yeah, hi, Christy. Can you clarify what maximum protection means and what that would restrict specifically?
Maximum protections, meaning maintaining a riparian buffer of forest mainly, or what other type of natural surrounding habitats along the streams would be, restricting activities within those buffers.
So any activities within those buffers?
Mainly activities, removing trees, soil disturbance, invasive plant removal would be wonderful, but trying to limit the impacts, especially on soil and forest cover.
So just one more clarifying question. The only activity that you would be okay with is invasive species removal? Is that typically?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I think that this is something for discussion. I'm not seeing all or nothing here, but it's just concerning to have any kind of heavy equipment moving through buffers. The damage that's done from that is it takes a long time for a forest to repair itself, especially soils. But you know, if there was an activity that was needed for you know, forest management of some kind to benefit functioning of that buffer, for instance, thinning might be needed as long as it's not logging. I think that could happen, and that could be done with hand tools.
Okay, another clarifying question from Jean Montgomery.
I wanted to know if you were speaking of state lands again. Is that true?
Well, all public forest lands is just the generality of it. Because we're not just speaking of state lands, but there are exemptions to some of these buffer standards. And when I say the highest standards, I mean that based on the literature, the most ecosystem services that can be protected by a certain width of a buffer. And I'm thinking category 1 stream buffers.
There are many existing regulations that do provide that protection, including the areas that are trout production waters with a 300-foot buffer, the Pinelands Commission regulations with a 300-foot buffer on most wetlands, especially all that have T&E habitat. And also, if you take a look at the New Jersey State Forest Stewardship Guidelines, they require some of the things that you're talking about. Streamside management zones have to be addressed in all the forest stewardship plans, including having a minimal 50-foot buffer to anything wider than that, prohibiting equipment that goes with the slopes, use of mats, use of hand equipment, things like that. Those things are already existing in the regulations. So I think we need to take a look at, I think this proposal would need to take a look at the State Freshwater Protection Act rules, the forestry rules, to make sure that the things that you're looking for aren't already being provided for in these regulatory requirement documents before forestry is done in state lands or any other type of activities are done on state lands. Thanks.
And I understand you two are in correspondence with each other already. So
Yeah, I had said what I just said.
Great. So
Yes.
did you want to respond, Christy, or?
No, I am not an expert on the regulations that exist. I just know that there are exemptions to some of the regulations and that some of the practices, agriculture for one, you know, some of the streams and agricultural areas do not have buffers really. So I'm just making a suggestion of having the strongest protections. And this is just a first kind of crack at making that recommendation, since these are public forest lands and they're in the public trust.
Okay. All right, we'll move to Douglas Meckel.
Hello, hi. I want to say I support this. I know a little bit. My loved one who's here with me knows more about the freshwater regulations, and a lot of them are only 50 feet and 300 is the maximum. So what she says about the C1, basically providing that protection to other waters is important. And the vernal pools, we're involved in the macroinvertebrate stream monitoring and then amphibian crossing. So a lot of amphibians do get squished, and there isn't really uplands protection once you go out. So that protecting the uplands that are associated with the vernal pool is important. And I think that's, I would support that. But that's, you know, my perspective is knowing about that stuff a little bit and then being there. The other question about activity is we've done planning with somebody, I'm sure people heard of the Roots to Rivers, where there were grants for tree planting along riparian zones. So there's been a lot of trees planted, some very successful, some not as successful. But would that activity be curtailed, because sometimes they do use heavier equipment to do the planning? So that's just my question about what we have. Part of the government right now is funding tree planting in these riparian zones. Would that affect that at all? So those are my comments, and that's my suggestion as far as I do like the proposal. I do see it does go further than the rules as I know them now. So thanks.
Okay, any opportunity to comment, Christy, or we can go?
Yes. Okay, so yeah, I wasn't thinking on my toes before when Kristen asked me that question. So we actually do riparian restoration in along streams where the riparian corridor is compromised or there's no buffer at all. We plant trees and we do once in a while use an auger. For the most part, these areas are very disturbed already and are not healthy. So I don't think that should be an excluded activity. I think there's certain forests, like I was saying, there's things I'm sure that we could think of that would have to be allowed in these riparian areas.
Okay, so next up is Elliot Ruga.
Hi, Christy, how are you? I just wanted to clarify for you, you may or may not be aware, but every one of those protections you are suggesting we have, 300-foot buffers for our C1 waters, 1,000-foot buffers for vernal pools, protection of steep slopes. Every one of those is provided for in the Highlands Act governing the Highlands Preservation Area, which is mostly the most mature forest we have in northern New Jersey. But every one of those is exempt for forestry activities. So, I mean, we would really welcome this. It may be just more simply accomplished by clarifying that that exemption only applies to private land, not public lands. But maybe that's a proposal that can be combined with yours down the line.
So yeah, I see another collaboration potential there. So Christy, I've heard from Jean and now Elliot.
Yeah, Elliot, I agree. And I think I used those numbers based on the Highlands Act to say what we should be applying to all of our public forests.
Okay, next up is Ken Dulski.
Yeah, so two things quickly. One, I believe there are, if not regulatory controls, best management practices of some sort that do provide some of these protections. And a major issue is that they're not enforced. So without enforcement, you can write this all you want till the cows come home and it doesn't mean anything. So it just has to be penalties and it has to be funding to enforce it. And otherwise we're just wasting our time. And second, as with Greg's proposal, I'm going to object to anything that seems to accept the status quo of logging in the Highlands or logging on New Jersey public land. So I appreciate that language being changed.
Okay, Christy, if you wanted to respond, or is there a question?
Yes, enforcement is a big issue, I think, especially on private lands. I'm not really sure about on forested public lands, whether the rules are adhered to, especially since Elliot just pointed out that there's exemptions for forestry. And I think there does need to be more enforcement. We should be funding people to be doing that enforcement more. And I think I would appreciate the language. I forget what you said, forest management. Was that the language that was being suggested for Greg's proposal or?
I can send you something. No, forest management is not very acceptable either, but
okay.
And
could you send that to me and
I'll send you something, yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
But then we have to check if that's acceptable to everybody, whatever changes we make in the language.
We're running low on time, but I think we have time for one or two. We might not resolve this particular one today. So, but let's take another one. Emil DeVito.
I think we need to reserve time to do a deep dive on exactly what regulations exist because, and John Thonet might be a better person to speak to this, but I'm pretty sure that there are almost no actual regulations in terms of what can and cannot be done in an approved forest stewardship plan. There are guidelines, there are best management practices. They don't have to be followed. There's nothing, as far as I can tell, that is an actual regulation that can't be broken when it comes to forestry. And I could be wrong about that, but we need to do a deep dive because we have seen approved forest plans that have no buffers to anything. And that is simply, that cannot be any longer after this task force is done. So we need to set aside time to do that. The one comment I have or question I have about Christie's proposal is it needs to be different for the Pine Barrens and outside the Pine Barrens, because in the Pine Barrens where you have sand and you don't have steep slopes and you need to create fire breaks, there needs to be a different set of limits, a less restrictive set of limits in terms of what you can do in wetlands and that sort of thing, in order to protect cedar swamps and other critical habitats that we don't want to see consumed by wildfires. But more importantly, we need to do a deep dive because all of us need to understand the base regulations, and I don't think any of us do.
Oh, Tom, you're on mute. I see you're talking. You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. It may be that this may be our first situation where we've got an issue that it makes sense to kick to a subgroup, because if we're going to do a deep dive, we can't do a deep dive with the full group here, but it feels like there's a need for some subset of people to get a better understanding of what the existing regulations are that that currently apply to public lands, right? And then to kind of flesh out a refined, version of this proposal and bring it back to the full work group. So it just feels to me like that might be the right approach on this issue.
I agree. Christy, is that okay with you?
Yes, yes, that sounds great. Yeah, I know this needs to be fleshed out more. I would appreciate working with pretty much everybody who's commented here and John and Greg on this further.
Yeah.
If I put my email in the chat, do you want to contact me? And Emil, your point about the Pine Barrens, I would love to talk to you about that more.
Yeah, I guess there's two ways we could handle this. We could have just people contact you, Christy. We could have people, if we're actually going to create a more, I won't say formal, but somewhat formal subgroup here, we could have people send their names to Allison, and then we'll, then we can compile them and, help to facilitate, some conversation among all interested parties.
Okay, I think that sounds like a good idea to do it that way.
That sounds
Okay.
good.
So anybody who wants to be a part of that subgroup should put in the chat your name to Allison Schmeider, and then we'll create that subgroup. But Christy, obviously, I think you should kind of convene and coordinate it, and then we can figure out how we can support you in that.
Okay. Would this be also working with John and Greg, combining proposals, or are they even combinable? We had consensus on their proposals pretty much.
I would leave those aside. I would just focus on this issue of regulation, right? And it's what understanding the existing regulations that apply to forest management on our public lands, and then building upon what you have there with that understanding to craft. And it would be nice if hopefully this subcommittee has got a diversity of perspectives, so you guys can kind of hammer it out, right? If there are people that have concerns about how this is shaped, I encourage you to be part of that subcommittee so you can have your views, factored into the conversations at the subcommittee level. So hopefully you come back to the full work group with something that people on the subcommittee, have all had input in and hopefully are on board with. And if you can't, then you let us know, and we'll see how we can help, resolve the situation.
Can you just summarize it again one more time so that everyone knows what this subgroup is going to be doing?
I want to add something, Eileen. I'm going to suggest, Emil, I'm throwing it to you. That Emil helps Christy on this one, since he suggested that we should look into the regulations.
I just assumed that would happen.
Making
Don't assume
sure.
that's gonna happen.
Just making sure.
Okay, so Christy, if you could just a sentence or two so that folks that have been listening, maybe they haven't been speaking, but so they get a really good sense of what this subgroup is and they can decide if they want to join.
We're calling the subgroup together to work on understanding the existing regulations on public lands, especially as it pertains to buffer sizes on streams and wetlands and vernal pools, because it seems we don't fully agree on what those regulations are, and we all benefit from that, so that we could then try to discuss what we would like to see in place on public forest lands. And if you send your email to Allison, she'll add you to the list, and then we'll convene a meeting separately.
Okay, that sounds good. I still see hands up. So I thought this one, not that it's resolved, but that there was a number of different actions we can take on proposals, right? Consensus, objections, and one was the formation of a subgroup. So that's where we've landed with this one. Given that, if you still have a question, well, if your hand is up, we can take it. We are running low on time, but I want to give you an opportunity if your hand was up. So Dave Jenkins, your hand is up.
Yeah, this clarification question for Christy. In response to one of the earlier questions about what you meant by maximum protection, you said you would be okay with thinning, but not okay with logging. And I'm trying to understand how you understand the difference between those two.
When I said what I was just sort of thinking about potential activities to help with forest development. And what I was talking about was more leaving the trees on site, not removing them as you would with logging activities or salvaging activities.
So logging isn't a means to an end of thinning the forest in your description there, because you remove the product. That's the main differentiation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm as a stewardship person on nature preserves. When we have thinned our forests where we had very young trees growing very densely together, and we left them on site to decompose and be part of stay in the forest ecosystem.
Okay, you good, Dave? All right, there's two more clarifying questions if folks are okay with staying. Tom, is that okay?
Yeah.
But then we'll stop at those. All right, so Elaine Mann.
Yes, I apologize before, Tom, because the computer went off totally. I don't know what happened when you were asking me a question. I'm sorry, so we'll have to get back to that one. But on this issue, we have a situation here in Colts Neck where a developer had 39 homes. There was watershed issues. It's in a C1 zone. He put a buffer zone up, but he's going to have an amphidome, and he went to the court and he asked for builder's remedy, and now he's building 360 homes, which may affect 35,000 people's water. And the DEP is doing zero. Thank you. That's all I have to say. So please put in there that builder's remedy is not a solution to helping our forests and our water system. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that comment. And Jean Montgomery, this will be the last question.
We got to get Jean unmuted there.
Emil, I would like to know what specific example you are speaking of where you are saying on public or state forest lands, riparian or some other buffers were not being observed that were required to be observed in the approved forestry plan for that area.
Oh, we need to unmute Emil to address that. Where is he?
It's my belief that it's not even a regulation that in order to do a forestry project on public land, that anyone even needs to get an approved forestry plan. I don't believe there's a regulation. I mean, right now, the state is writing forest stewardship plans and having stewardship, stakeholder meetings and doing those things, but they're only doing that as a policy. I believe that right now, if on any kind of public land that's uplands, right? You can do whatever you want and you don't have to tell anybody. That's what I believe. Now, if you enter into a wetland, you need to get an approved forest stewardship plan. And then that comes along with certain guidelines. But those guidelines, in many cases, are violated. There was a forestry plan approved on township parkland in Roaring Rock Park, where the logging had no buffer at all to a C1 high quality legacy, I believe it was called, trout stream, right? And no enforcement action occurred. So we're all over the place and we need to figure out what the rules are, what is allowed now by regulation versus what is just the policy practice of the current administration, right? That can change, policy can change on a dime. And the DEP can say, we're not going to consult with anybody. We're going to go log an upland on a steep slope. And if it's an upland, they don't have to tell anybody. They can just go do it. And I'm pretty sure I'm right.
Well, this
no.
this new subgroup is going to evaluate current regulations. So I'm going to end this conversation here because I'm not too sure if all of the expertise is being represented. So the subgroup will go over that. So that was our last question from Jean. Tom, Anjali, Andy, any closing comments or procedures for moving forward?
I just want to thank everyone who has submitted proposals. It's amazing the number of proposals we have and the time and the thought that people have put into these. I want to thank everyone for what I thought, was a good kind of constructive, respectful conversation today. This is good. We're getting a little bit of, sort of success under our belts and something we can build upon as we get into more difficult, more difficult issues. So,
yeah.
With that.
And more information will be sent via email. We know the shared folder is getting bigger, but that's where everything will be posted. So keep an eye on your email. We'll be updating the links page up, so that you'll have access to any proposals that are being discussed in the future. Okay, Anjali, Andy, anything else?
No, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Next meeting's in 2 weeks, right? So we'll be in touch with
Yep.
more details about the agenda for those as soon as we can. So,
All righty.
all right.
All
Thanks,
right. Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Have a great night.